Today we're going to tackle Mama, which is a horror movie, and Crimson Peaks, which is Del Toro's gothic romance. Some of you might be wondering why I'm combining these specific two movies. Originally, I planned to combine Pan's Labyrinth, The Orphanage, and Mama together as a triple feature, but when I was rewatching them, I realized that even though Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage had a lot in common, and I believe you can see that in the channel here, Mama was just different enough that it needed its own separate video. And unfortunately for Mama, it has a really interesting ending, but a lot of the stuff leading up to it is just not that exciting. So I didn't have a full video's worth of content from Mama, and it left me wondering if I was gonna put it on the cutting room floor or what my plans were for it. And that's when I remembered I still had Crimson Peak on the docket. And I realized that there is a lot of similarities between Mama and Crimson Peak if we're going to be discussing families, family love, the perversion of family love, and these gothic horror ghost death comparisons. And since I love Crimson Peak so much, I don't really have a lot of constructive things to say or even that many observational points, because when I'm watching it, I'm just sitting there and soaking up the joy of everything that's Crimson Peak. I thought I'd combine them together in tonight's double feature. So Mama released in 2013, and Guillermo del Toro was the executive producer and also the presenter for the film. The director for this film is Andy Muschietti. And I'm sorry, I know I'm pronouncing that wrong. This was a debut film of his. Del Toro wanted to executive produce this film because he saw the original short for Mama that Andy Muschietti had put out, and he thought that it could be something special and interesting in a longer format. Unlike some of the other Guillermo del Toro presents, he had to be very present to get Mama bankrolled. So actually, when he was filming Pacific Rim in one studio, Mama was filming in the other studio. He'd spend days on set in Pacific Rim directing, and then he would spend his mornings, his evenings, and his weekends helping Andy Muschietti pick out cast, figure out the setting and the story blocking, and figure out the film grading, the editing, all of those kind of little nitpicky things to help make the movie feel authentic and come together as one whole creative project. And while it's clear that Del Toro did have a hand in Mama and worked tirelessly with the director to help make his vision come to life, I do think that of all of the Del Toro presents and executive productions he does, this specific film has a lot less of his traditional style and signature to it. Meanwhile, Crimson Peak was co-written and directed by Del Toro in 2015. He originally wrote this script shortly after Pan's Labyrinth, but then had to sort of shelve it for now while he did other projects. The fact that we have Crimson Peak at all is 100% by chance. He pitched 3 different ideas: The Count of Monte Cristo, The Mountains of Madness, and Crimson Peak to the studios, and they chose Crimson Peak. I am in love with Crimson Peak. I think it is beautiful and atmospheric, and in 2015 it was something a little bit different than what we were seeing. Del Toro loves all things dark and gothic, so like all other movies till now, we have to ask, is Mama and Crimson Peak gothic? Of course, my answer is yes, they are both gothic. For those that don't know, on this channel we have 9 points that could make a story gothic. You only need 3 of those 9 points to qualify. If you want a review on those points, you can go ahead and check out the video here. Unlike Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage, Mama and Crimson Peak vary in exactly how many gothic points they have. Mama has 7 of the 9 gothic points, and Crimson Peak has 8. Starting with horror elements, of the 2 films, Mama is closest to a traditional horror. Like many of Del Toro's works, Mama plays on that human desire to protect and shelter children. We are scared for those kids because they're alone in the elements except for a ghost, and we don't really know how predictable or reliable that is. The ghost has already killed their father. And granted, Mama made that decision as the father was about to kill the 2 children, but we have seen that she's capable of harm. And of course, I went into Crimson Peak knowing that it probably wouldn't be like your traditional Conjuring, and it probably wouldn't even have the same level of scare as something like Sinister did at the time. I was looking like more moody, atmospheric goth. Guillermo del Toro says that it's a love story, not a horror story, even though the advertising at the time pitched it more horror themed. I was actually kind of surprised because they have this little mini adventure where Edith's mom's died, and immediately the next night comes back to her as a ghost, and the ghost design is terrifying. Not to mention that Crimson Peak makes use of really loud music and some jump scary effects, so I wasn't on the edge of my seat, heart pounding out of my chest like I was with something like Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. I still had that sense of high tension For characters, King, Mama is the weaker of these two examples. It has a lot of problems when it comes to characterization, even though it should be an entirely character-driven movie. For example, it uses like that feral child motif and the public's fascination with children that have been abandoned in the woods and then are like re-civilized, which is an interesting enough theme, but the movie gives us very little time with this element. We don't really know the children that well, like before they were abandoned in the woods, during their woods time. We don't even really get that great a look at them in the rehabilitation from the woods. It's more like the idea is there than the movie actually showing us what it needs to develop that. The movie also works really hard to develop the character of Mama, and it gives her a backstory as a depressed or possibly mentally unwell woman in the olden days who was shoved in an asylum. Her baby was taken from her, and she escapes and tries to get that baby back, which of course leads to tragic ends. But this is like a pretty common stereotype and trope within horror. Like, we see women thrown in asylums for punitive reasons all the time, and we don't get like enough of that backstory. And where this is such a prevalent stereotype and trope, I really needed more to develop that and make her feel like a real character instead of like just a boilerplate stamp for us to keep moving with. Even Annabelle as the rocker chick who doesn't want kids and wants to live that musical life forever, being transformed into someone who has to take care of these two children for the sake of her boyfriend, is just very stereotypical, very shallow, like archetype kind of thing. Everyone feels just a little bit flat and not fully realized. The one thing that saves this is the ending of Mama. Ties some of those little gestures and little like attempts at characterization together and gives those characters some arc and some fleshing out and development that they really needed. Meanwhile, Crimson Peak is beautifully character driven. If you don't care about Edith and Edith's story, I don't know why you would watch Crimson Peak. Thomas and Lucille Sharp are wonderfully portrayed characters, Thomas being kind of like a moody, sensitive boy with a little bit of mystery, and Lucille being like that expressive, slightly bold, deviant, kind of like almost role model to Edith at first, but like she has this sort of knowing, cunning darkness that Edith can't quite unravel and that eventually leads to bad ends. I love comparing like Edith's brash naivety, adventurous spirit with like Lucille's more tempered, subversive spirit. And I think the three of them together, their chemistry, their scenes, is like the heart and the soul of Crimson Peak. Some of the other characters around them are a little bit more cardboard cutouty. They're kind of doing archetypical things, or they're there as like set dressing, but I'm not mad at it because the development between Edith, Thomas, and Lucille is really there. Next is going to be more poetic prose. So a couple of things to put out there is a lot of the work in Mama did not age well, and I don't know if it was ever really that good. It's sort of hard for me to say because even though I saw this movie in theaters in 2013, I don't remember whether or not I found the effects like good or not. And also when it comes to the visuals in Mama, a lot of it is not really my thing, even though it's done well. So it was hard for me to give this the point because I don't really like it, but there's definitely several elements that are highly stylized and that do help drive this story. So for starters, the whole movie has a very muted color palette, and I think it does really well in this particular movie because Mama comes out of like this dark pit, and so having like that gray muted tone where everything is sort of like playing with the black dark gives Mama a lot of different places where she could like pop up. I think the feral children's all four movements, which was done with CGI, still holds up pretty well, but like when you see them in the background or like hopping out of boxes and stuff, you're not really sure at first if it's the kids or if it's Mama. You know, that tension is really there and working. The use of the butterflies and moths is atmospheric and wonderful symbolism. There's one excellent sequence where we can see Lily in her room through the doorway playing tug of war with, we assume, her sister Victoria, and Annabelle is walking in the hallway. She can't see Lily here, and as Annabelle is walking towards Lily's room to drop off the laundry, Victoria shows up in the hallway and asks Annabelle for something, and that's when we know that Lily has been playing with Mama the whole time, and Annabelle was just this close to catching her at it and like awful things unleashing. I wish there had been more scenes like that in the movie. The overall jittery effects of Mama are fine. I think this was new at the time, and we've seen a lot more of like these like jittery, stuttery ghosts at this point in time, so I'm kind of over it. They have this weird like hair blob thing that like surfaces up in his mama, and I hate that. I think it's awful. Meanwhile, Crimson Peak has got to be Guillermo del Toro's most beautiful movie. Everything about it is just breathtaking. The costumes, the rooms, the house that is Crimson Peak is stunning. There's so many little details and set work and pieces that like every time I watch, something new catches my eye. Like many of Del Toro's movies, the use of color here is done exquisitely well. This movie also has a butterfly moth kind of theme, and they have a really great scene between Edith and Lucille that kind of like foreshadows a lot of things and lets us know that Edith isn't just sort of dressed in these flowery garments and like a little bit like a butterfly, but she is the weak butterfly, and Lucille is the dangerous moth that eats the butterflies. Next is going to be elements of loneliness and longing. Obviously, within Mama, both Lily and Victoria have been separated from any human contact for I think it was like 5 years. There's a level of isolation between Annabelle and the world that she knew because she just like cold turkey stops being a bass player or a rocker. Her boyfriend gets hospitalized and she's just there alone in the house with the girls dealing with their day-to-day needs completely unprepared. Crimson Peak also has Edith isolated. Before she goes to Crimson Peak, she is isolated from society around her because she wants to do something different than her expected role. She is aspiring to be a writer and to have a career, and all the other ladies are kind of like making fun of her. So she's kind of like a fish out of water in her own life, which is part of what attracts her to Thomas, physically separated from everyone who might help her or care about her when she goes to Crimson Peak. Next is going to be human mortality. Ghost stories are always tied to life and death, and as both Mama and Crimson Peak are stories with ghosts in them, they touch on whether or not the characters will live or die. Death is preferable to certain kinds of existence. Very gothic, very atmospheric. And of course, next is a supernatural element, and again, as both Mama and Crimson Peak are ghost stories, and ghosts are inherently supernatural, you're gonna find those sort of like spooky, haunting jump scares. I do think the difference between the two ghosts is really interesting. In Mama's depiction, she is a little bit sinister. She has that like potentially deadly, harmful edge. Does she love them? Does she care about them? Is she good? Can she just not adapt to change? Like, what is going on with that? And in Crimson Peak, the ghosts are almost entirely benevolent or unconcerned with humanity. Edith's mother's ghost is the first one we're introduced to, and she's driven by love to warn her daughter about something in her future she doesn't want her to face. The other ghosts at Crimson Peak seem to be like accidentally interacting with Edith, and they're existing there mostly through like their anger and their desire for vengeance or their desire to prevent other people to come to the same bad end they did. And it's really interesting because the ghosts are so scary looking and grotesque and terrifying, but they're acting in like a neutral to benevolent kind of way. And it really makes you ask yourself a couple more questions, whether we judge people by their looks or their actions, and then how we sort of like overcome that like gut fear of the unknown. Questioning a character's mental health and reality. I gave the point to Mama here because we're talking about rehabilitating the girls from like a feral state to like a normal societal state, and we're evaluating the kind of damage that long-term isolation has done them and whether or not we can help bring them back to society. Crimson Peak could have like a half point on this, but not really. The half point for me comes in the fact that Thomas and Lucille sort of gaslight Edith when she does start explaining or asking questions about things she's learned from the ghosts. An additional mental health issue in Crimson Peak is Thomas and Lucille are both suffering from a traumatic childhood, but this isn't the kind of like mental health and mental reality that we're looking for in a gothic work. While like that childhood trauma could turn into them having like delusions or a mental break that would lead to the goth appeal, that's not really how it's portrayed in Crimson Peak. Makes use of local folklore and myth. So in this case, Mama doesn't get the point. It has a lot of internal mythology, like we spend time learning about the history of the land they're on and Mama and all of that stuff, but it's not like real folklore or real legend. It's like internal, which to be fair is part of Mama's charm. It just doesn't qualify for the goth point. While Crimson Peak also builds its own history and framework, it also pulls from a strong Gothic tradition. When we look at the house, when we look at how it's a female-led story, which is traditionally Gothic, when we look at all the set pieces and framing, you kind of know them and are familiar with them if you're familiar with Gothic lit. And lastly is going to be a strong sense of place. Again, here Mama gets like kind of a half-point vibe. There is a real attempt to build a strong sense of place within the Mama world, but it just doesn't work. Where the story happens could be like anywhere in the world. And in fact, I don't think they picked the best spot for it because they set it in West Virginia. And I actually think the setting would be most fitting in upstate New York, because in upstate New York, you could still get that snowy mountainous terrain. You could still get that isolated area. You could explain how Annabelle and the boyfriend are like into a music, like artist, kind of city style. I don't know where in West Virginia they're doing that work. And you could bring in the Pennsylvania Dutch Amish element into the story if you wanted to. And I think that Mama is most missing like that historical connection tied to the land, and bringing in like an Amish element might actually help that. Meanwhile, Crimson Peak, I feel like it should get 2 points for how strong the sense of place is. As soon as Edith goes to the house, that is like a character all on its own. I felt like I knew the outside, I knew the basement, I knew the upstairs, I got the elevator, and everyone has their own room with their own things. It's just a very special experience if you go into it paying attention to the house and paying attention to that atmosphere. Mama did not hold up visually. This movie, more than any of the other debut films that we have reviewed, like Don't Be Afraid of the Dark or The Orphanage, really feels like it's a debut movie. There are a couple of interesting visuals worth pointing out. The intro credits do a lot of heavy lifting, and I kind of wish the story had been more what we had seen in the credits, because it has a bunch of like child drawings of the different phases of Lily and Victoria, going from like scared humans to like more animalistic lifestyle. And in particular, it shows how this made Victoria sad. The more girls interacting with Mama, we could have like really got some more bonding, loving, caring scenes, and that could have really helped us draw more conclusions or like more organically feel connected to Mama and what she's done for the girls. The apartment Annabelle and her boyfriend live in before they move to the big house with the girls is full of a ton of clutter. And even though I didn't appreciate this cluttered look, I think it was their attempt at having like a detailed set that told you a lot about the characters. Because if you looked at the mess that was behind them, you could see like drawings of monsters and like all kinds of little bits and pieces. I did think there were lighting issues in Mama. The balance was not there. And I know it could have been because it was great in Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, but I found like it was either too light and like I was seeing way too much of something that I needed like a little pullback on, or it was way too dark and I just wasn't getting enough sense of anything to be scared or to be like anxious at all. Crimson Peak is so much style. Thank goodness for the strong acting talent that's in Crimson Peak, because this is a movie that is so visually appealing and stunning and interesting to look at that it would be very easy for the scenery and the costumes and the way everything was shot to overwhelm the actual story. Moving into storytelling components, Mama opens with a mini adventure, and it's the first time this kind of storytelling doesn't work for me. I kind of felt like I was watching real time as the movie was pitched instead of watching like a little taste of something to pull me in. A lot of the details and information we were given we didn't need and didn't help us in any way. Dragging in the woods, happening to find the cabin, different shots of the cabin that don't establish anything because we don't spend any time in that cabin. I don't think knowing that Mama is real and knowing that she's able to hurt human people like actually helps the movie in any kind of way. A lot of time is taken up with these scenes between the psychiatrist and the girls where he's like slowly coming to believe Mama is real, but the audience already knows Mama is real, so there's no tension there. I know Musetti had a lot of challenges going into this. He had a short film seed idea that he needed to build out into a full-length film. Based off of like his response to the short film, I'm sure he thought the things he needed to like build out were like, how did the girls get in the abandoned cabin? Why is Mama there? What does she want? Even though these might have been the audience questions coming out of his short film, that's not necessarily the story he should have told, and I think the whole thing suffers a lot for it. The movie is only an hour and 40 minutes, and it feels incredibly long because there's so much repetition. For example, we get Mama's backstory 3 separate times. Victoria tells us in one of those god-awful dark interviews between her and the psychologist, which FYI, all of that was way too long and could have gone away. We get her backstory again from a historian who very easily finds that information. So there's no mystery or searching or any of that. And then we get it one more time in a really terrible CGI dream sequence with Annabelle. Mama also made a really odd choice with the antagonist because they want the audience to empathize with Mama and feel for her. I don't think she could properly be considered an antagonist, and so they needed some other kinds of like dark negative forces in the movie, and they decide to do this by having the murdered mother's sister fight for custody with the brother of the dad who killed that mom. Everything about her made her look like she would be better to take custody of the children, but they just sort of like had her be angry at the brother, not really get to interact with the children, and then they killed her off for reasons. Like, she seemed like a nice lady. I don't know what the issue was, and I'm still kind of confused as to why the courts ruled against her taking custody of the children. Like, I could see the courts ruling against her taking them away from this facility for a while until they acclimate, but that's not the same as giving custody over to the brother because he's just like in a good location. But also the evil psychologist out for his own gains, like, it was really muddied because he was a cross between a psychologist and a ghost hunter, and it didn't blend well. I guess his motive was just that he wanted to write like the bestest paper in the world. And it's true, when we find feral children, we have to be concerned about the scientists and behavioral team who are supposed to be helping them, because sometimes they're not helping develop them or helping them acclimate so much as they are trying to write a really great paper or make themselves feel really important. There are a lot of imperfect elements with the character of Annabelle, but I think nothing stands out to me more than how stilted and awkward her like punk rock girl facade is. I don't believe for a minute that she's like a band chick. It just doesn't come off as believable or buyable to me at all. They should have found something else for her, especially because they're in West Virginia. I'm not saying there are no rock bands in West Virginia, but the scene there is not really that big of a thing, and it wasn't that big a thing in 2013 either. Annabelle, Victoria, and Lily like relationship some credit. It's nowhere near as good as the Kim-Sally relationship in Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, but there are specific individual moments where it feels like Annabelle is bonding with Victoria and then where Annabelle bonds with Lily. And it does feel like they're all coming together to be a family unit, and I think especially when we consider the ending, these elements are probably the most interesting parts of the movie. It shows 2 adoptive mothers really fighting for attention between these children and fighting for custody. Mama is actually a great allegory for like the whole blended co-parenting family and the fears that are associated with that today. Losing custody, losing place in a child's life, or trying to figure out where someone's place is when someone new comes into the picture, and trying to like blend different lifestyles and different rules and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't get into like the nitty-gritty or give you like a detailed how-to guide, but I do think the overarching fear and terror that is in that for all the parties involved is present in something like Mama. Meanwhile, Crimson Peak is just storytelling genius. We start this film and end this film with Edith doing voiceover, and this is fun because the way she's doing voiceover and the fact that her character is a writer kind of suggests that she wrote this story down and got it published, harkening back to a Gothic tradition. It also starts out with a great mini adventure and tells us to beware of Crimson Peak. So that's the other thing, is we're getting immediate foreshadowing, and we are learning that this story is going to be heavy on the foreshadowing and heavy on nuance and implication. All of that stuff is what I like to swim in when it comes to stories. Crimson Peak is steeped in that traditional Gothic feminism, and I love every second of it. Both Edith and Lucille just steal the center of all the scenes they're in. But I think there's like a lot of very relatable feminine issues in this story, because Edith is being discriminated against even when she's living happily with her dad in America. Her dad is on one side being really loving and doting and supportive of her. He's letting her chase her dreams, which in this case happens to be trying to be a fiction writer. And that's admirable, and you love the dad for it. But he is also kind of patronizing. Like, I don't think he ever expects her to be a successful writer. He's overbearing and protective of her in places he shouldn't be. And it's that, like, mixture of those things where, like, despite who she is, he's supportive of her, but he's also upholding standard patriarchal stereotypes. I think the idea of Crimson Peak is a lot of fun too. Like, the isolated manor that has the red clay mining, and the red clay is like seeping up from the ground and staining everything blood red, and there's all these bloody secrets in the manor. It works for me. It works for me every time I see it, and I can't get enough of it. So getting into the story of these two films, from my perspective, it feels like Mama sort of started a conversation in 2013 and Crimson Peak is continuing it. Del Toro mentions that one of the main themes that interested him in Mama is that a mother's love is forever, and he thinks the film Mama makes that scary. Mama as a protective mother figure, like domineering, and doesn't let anyone else step in to help mentor or teach Victoria and Lily different skills that they need to be successful in life. And I think Crimson Peak very much validates the a mother's love is forever sentiment. But there's like a core miscommunication where Edith has no context for Beware of Crimson Peak, and she's kind of scared of the ghost, so she doesn't know to avoid Thomas. But also Edith is a little bit afraid of ghosts in general and unsure of them, so when her mother comes back again to give another warning, it is actually that second warning that drives her into Thomas's arms and sets her on this roller coaster to go to Crimson Peak. It's not the same danger as Mama, but it is a related theme. Love and devotion and attempt to protect someone you care about actually drives them towards the danger instead of helping to steer them away. Both Mama and Crimson Peak use moths and butterflies as symbols of the supernatural and as stand-ins for the characters. I think Mama does this more just for aesthetic and implied meaning behind moths and butterflies. The black moth or butterfly really just symbolizes that Mama is there and watching more than it does like give us any further in-depth details. But Crimson Peak takes it even further. How Edith is dressed, and from a scene between Edith and Lucille, Edith is like a butterfly. She's got those brilliant colors. She has these costumes that really are designed like very floral and wing-like. She's young and she's naive and she's beautiful, but she's also weak and easily killed by any of the harshness of nature. And meanwhile, Lucille is like that moth. She's in those dark clothes, she hangs out in the dark, and she eats butterflies, and there's this warning and intent there. And we continue to see like the moth butterfly theme, not just where the butterflies are dying and the two women are talking about it and playing with them, but there are moths at Crimson Peak, and they're most present right before supernatural elements come in. And both Mama and Crimson Peak have what I would consider twist endings. Mama is the twistier of these two endings. I think it did something really unique and different, especially for expectations for horror in 2013. And I also think like this twisty ending we get from Mama is really the only reason you should watch the movie. It makes a lot of things that were frustrating about the movie worthwhile, and it makes some of the things that were kind of like nice little points pull together into something bigger. And I think Crimson Peak's ending probably took some people by surprise. It's actually like a pretty common twist in Gothic literature, so I wasn't personally surprised by it. But whether you found it twisty or not, it is a highly satisfying ending. First of all, it continues the feminism beat because Edith's guy friend, who probably wanted to date her, comes to save her and is immediately put out of commission, so he's totally useless. Awesome. I was kind of pissed off when he showed up, so I was happy for him to get the heck out of the scene. And Edith again is put in a situation where she either has to save herself or die on her own. And speaking of dying, I about died the first time I saw the conversation between Thomas and Lucille, where Thomas is trying to convince Lucille that they shouldn't kill Edith, and he just says that they can all go away together. That moment is the single moment in Tom Hiddleston's performance that most reminded me that he was playing Marvel's Loki. And I like half expected us to connect this off to the cinematic universe and for him to get that horn helmet back up on his head and for him to give like this crazy shit-eating grin because he just knows what he suggested was insane. And the fact that he didn't see what happened next coming just shows how like way out of left field, spacey, dreamy this character was. And both movies take on a twisted sense of family. Mama has quite a bit of like complicated family dynamics going on. First of all, we have Victoria and Lily's biological father killing their mother and abducting them. And then he plans to kill them as well rather than let them live a full life without him. Mama involved, and she kills the dad and takes over parenting of the children. And her parenting style is probably the best she can do, we don't really know, but it does lead the kids to be feral and antisocial and isolated from anyone else in society. So there's, some abuse, trouble issues there. Much the way the father would rather kill the girls than be separated from them, Mama has a similar protect them and keep them away from others and possibly destroy the girls rather than have them removed from her care kind of vibe going on. And Crimson Peak sort of explores an abusive family through Lucille and Thomas. They had neglectful and abusive parents that kind of drove them to an unnatural level of closeness that ends up being incestuous. It's again that twisting of trust and love and devotion from something that's really strong and beautiful and that we often uphold to something that's dark and twisted and wrong. While varied in execution, both Mama and Crimson Peak have something really interesting to say about love, devotion, and desires that linger after death. If you want an imperfect movie with some unique ghostly elements, Mama might be your Halloween jam. And if you want to revel in the most beautiful Victorian Gothic ghost love romance that I can think of, Crimson Peak is perfectly atmospheric for a dark Halloween night. Both have big fantasy sets with interesting visuals. There is a highly stylized visual experience with attention to set and costume details. Obviously, Crimson Peak does this better, but I do think there was attention both to set and costuming in Mama as well, to a lesser degree. Shining a light in the dark, macabre, and horrific. I think specifically in these two movies, we took things that are usually considered positive and lovely and explained how they can go too far and become dark and twisted. Mama lacks any reference to the underground, but Crimson Peak, the house, has a basement where all of the red clay and secrets are buried, and they have these vats of red clay that look like blood boiling up, and sometimes there's bones being stirred around in there. It's great. It's so creepy and epic and goes right around with that underground theme Del Toro usually rocks. Del Toro humanizes all of the characters, including villains. We see this more in Mama, where she's probably supposed to be both the antagonist and in some ways the hero of the film. And we also champion unlikely heroes and uplift characters that aren't usually featured. I think having Edith stand on her own 2 feet and be triumphant against the big bad Lucille is a very special moment because in every way, it looks like there's no way Lucille can lose. She's meaner, she's crueler, she hits and attacks without hesitation, she has experience. It's a wonderfully triumphant moment to see Edith step out at the right time when Lucille finally has a moment where she pauses and get her before she can get got. The work stress the importance of family, whether biological or found family, and they highlight the power of love and devotion, sometimes to a destructive degree. Of all of the works I've seen of Del Toro so far, I think these two relate the most to Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage. All four of the movies start at the same core place, and then they take diverging paths in how they execute. Have you seen Mama? Have you seen Crimson Peaks? What did you think? And as always, keep reading. Bye!